Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the top 10 albums by English pop rock perfectionists ELO. ELO formed in 1970 in the Midlands of England, in Birmingham, the same place that Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and a few other bands came from. But ELO were cut from a decidedly poppier cloth. They were formed by singer-songwriter Roy Wood, who was in a band called The Move with drummer Bev Bevan, who he brought along, with Jeff Lynne from the Idol race, a sort of guitarist and a singer, also on the local scene. The idea was that they would combine guitars and a pop rock sensibility with cellos and violins to create a new sound. And it was a new sound, and before long they got a deal with Harvest Records. But Roy Wood left in 1972 to form Wizzard, who had a massive perennial Christmas hit with I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day. And Jeff Lynne took over the reins and piloted the ELO starship to international fame and fortune throughout the sort of late 70s and early 80s. They did seem to fall out of fashion a bit in the mid to late 80s, and Jeff Lynne eventually sort of jettisoned everyone in the band except piano player Richard Tandy, and they came to be known as Jeff Lynne's ELO, whilst the other members went on to form ELO Part 2, or some of the other members. Heavily influenced by the Beatles and chock full of melody, I think ELO for many people was seen as a bit of a guilty pleasure. But I think those of us in the know have got no qualms about loving their music and being out and proud about it. There's been a huge reevaluation, I think, of their back catalogue in the last few years, helped in no small way by the song Mr. Blue Sky, which I think is one of those huge songs that seemingly every generation taps into and enjoys for its feel-good factor. They've sold over 50 million albums, and they hold the record for the most top 40 Billboard hits without having a number one. In 2017, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I think Jeff Lynne, he's such a craftsman and melodicist that there is pretty much something to enjoy on every ELO album. But, there's always at least one cracking song, even if the whole album maybe doesn't hold up and sustain the joy over two sides. I think a bit like Supertramp, they're still never really in the debate about great UK bands of all time, and perhaps not as influential or as cool. And that may have something to do with the constantly changing lineup they've had, which is far too complex to go into now. But we'll name the sort of key players along the way as we go. So let's get into it. And at number 10, as so often, my 10th choice is kind of a sort of out there controversial one, and this is no exception. It's from 1986. It's their 11th album, Balance of Power. Now, Balance of Power, by this point the band had been streamlined by Jeff Lynne to just himself, Bev Bevan and Richard Tandy. Now, and this is one of those albums I love because, I was a young teenager and I was really heavily getting into music, and I'd heard about ELO and I would love their back catalogue, and there was a new ELO album coming out. So you kind of make yourself love those records, don't you, when you're that age? But a lot of people, rightfully deride this album as being far too 80s. But I do have a soft spot because there are a lot of good songs and melodies on here, I think. Heaven Only Knows, So Serious, Getting to the Point, Calling America. I think if there hadn't been the 80s production on this album and you still had the orchestration and everything, I think this would be a much, much better album. The recording started in 1984, but Jeff Lynne felt that the album needed a much, much more current vibe. So all the synths were brought in, and that is fatal to the overall sound because a lot of the songs, I think, as I say, would be much, much better with the string arrangements rather than 80s synths. But look, if you can get past all that, there's a lot of retro 80s fun to be had here. The album got to number 9 in the UK, number 49 in the USA. And it's clear by this stage in the States that the uncool ELO vibe had started to set in. So look, by no means the greatest ELO album, and you could easily argue for other records to be at number 10 on this list, but I'm going to put it in for personal reasons, and it's my show, so there. At number 9, from 1973, their second album, ELO 2. This was originally titled Lost Planet. It was a concept album, but it was dropped. Roy Wood had left the band, although he does play uncredited on 2 songs on this album. This is long, multi-layered, complex arrangements. They were very heavily at this point into the orchestration side of the mashup they'd been planning. Jeff Lynne's pop sensibility really hadn't kicked in yet, and this is not a commercial record. It's most famous for Roll Over Beethoven, which is a sort of Chuck Berry Beethoven mashup. And funnily enough, Jeff Lynne so loved traditional rock and roll that he kind of always added a song in that vein to almost all the subsequent ELO albums. We've got Mike D'Albuquerque on bass. Richard Tandy makes his studio debut here on piano. The album got to 35 in the UK and 62 in the States, but I think it was clear that Harvest didn't really know what to do with the band at this point, or where they sort of fitted in the great scheme of things. So this ended up being their last album on the Harvest label. And subsequently, they made the album that's number 8 on my list from 1973, their third album, On the Third Day. This was released on United Artists in America and Warner Brothers in the UK. And it was also the first album where they dropped the definite article before their name. So they're no longer the Electric Light Orchestra. They are Electric Light Orchestra, or ELO, as many of us call them. The songs on this album are shorter than on the previous 2 albums, so maybe the message is starting to get through to Jeff Lynne. Side 1 is still conceptual, though, and there's a musical link between the songs. The most famous songs on the record are Showdown and Mama My Belle, but Showdown actually was not on the original UK release. It was put on subsequent albums, subsequent releases. I think this was an enjoyable record, but it's just the songs just aren't as sharp as they would become eventually. Mick Kaminsky's on violin, Mike Edwards is on the cellos, and they feature really, really heavily, as you'd expect. And especially on the Daft Closer, which is a sort of ploddy classical rock mashup of Grieg's In the Hall of the Mountain King. Number 52 in the States, but didn't chart in the UK. So by this point, it was really looking like, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, the ELO starship was going to fail to take off. At number 7, from 1983, their 10th album, Secret Messages. This was released on Jet Records, where they'd moved to after Warner Brothers and United Artists. And Jeff Lynne claims there's a vague concept about this album. He loves his concepts, Jeff Lynne, about hidden messages. There were claims in the early days of ELO that they'd hidden satanic messages on their albums. This was Jeff Lynne's response, making a record called Secret Messages. I'm not quite sure I buy that myself, but whatever he says. This was their last album with Kelly Grouchit, which is a shame because he was a great bass player. He was also really, really fabulous backing vocalist. They sadly fell out when Grouchit claimed that Lynne owed him royalties, and they eventually had to settle out of court. There are some really good singles on here, particularly I Love Four Little Diamonds and Rock and Roll is King, which is one of those rock and roll songs I was saying that Jeff Lynne loves to write. The rest feels a little bit ELO light. The tunes in the arrangements are sort of not quite as inspired as on previous efforts. Most of the string section have gone and the sound is a little bit pared down, so that the rich harmonic ELO sound isn't there, and I think it's sorely missing on a couple of songs. Number 4 in the UK and 36 in the States. It's all very listenable, but I think if this album was a date, I think you'd enjoy it, but you wouldn't be dying to see them again. At number 6 from 1974, their 4th album, El Dorado. It's still all quite conceptual by this, but on the 4th album. And there's the mix between the rock and the orchestral on this record is quite jarring at times. Hasn't quite got the balance right yet, I don't think. The pop songs suddenly slip into heavy orchestration. At times it is like listening to a classical record. Mr. Kingdom's a really good song that does sound a little bit like Across the Universe to me. Illusions in G Major is the rock and roll track. Can't Get Out of My Head is the lovely big hit on this record. It didn't chart in the UK, so they're still really struggling to get traction on home soil. But it got to number 16 in the States and went gold. Bevan says in his autobiography about ELO that was thanks in no small part to the album cover, which is the 2 red shoes from The Wizard of Oz, which is a huge hit in the States and had a massive cult following. And he believes the cover helped sell this album and gain ELO some fans in the States. Funnily enough, if you're looking for a really good ELO, really good rock biography to read, The Story of ELO by Bev Evan is really good fun. At number 5, from 1979, their 8th album, Discovery. So, you know, by now Jeff Lynne's well into his swing. He's got the balance right. This is chock full of great tunes. Got to number 1 in the UK, number 5 in the USA, platinum on both sides of the Atlantic. Shine a Little Love, Confusion, Diary of Horace the Wimp, Don't Bring Me Down, Last Train to London. Just loads of brilliant songs. There's half an album right there of fantastic songs. It's the first album in the UK to produce 4 top 10 hit singles from a single disc album. The sound is stripped back here, and there's even the subtlest concession to sort of, you know, dance music, disco beats. Richard Tandy called this album Disco Very. But it's the first album not to have Mick Kaminsky, Hugh McDowell or Melvin Gale on the record, although they did appear, oddly enough, in some of the videos for some of the songs. And, you know, whilst the singles are brilliant on here, the supporting cast is just not at the same level in comparison. And so while I think this is a really good ELO album, I don't think it's a great one. But that does bring us to the top 4 ELO albums, which I think are all absolutely essential for anyone looking to get into the band. And at number 4 from 1981, it's their 10th album, Time. Now, Time is a concept album about a man taken to the future where he is forced to reconcile all the cold, unfeeling technology with his desire to find his true love again. It's ludicrous, but it's brilliant and it's really good fun. And Jeff Lynne is so committed to the concept here. He throws everything into it. Of course, it's all buoyed by absolutely fabulous tunes. Twilight, Rain is Falling, Here is the News, Lights Go Down. The album's got a cult following now, and there are many, many ELO fans who love it and think it's their best. It got to number 1 in the UK, but only got to number 16 in the USA. And I think this is not helped by the Xanadu soundtrack, which they released prior to this. The soundtrack is perfectly okay. It's a bit patchy, but the film itself was a bit of a dog. It had Olivia Newton-John and none of the legendary Gene Kelly in it. But I think it was so badly regarded that there was some fallout on ELO's reputation, and hence the sort of poor showing for such a great record in the States in the charts. But this is regarded by many people as their most influential album. Certainly you can hear shades of this in the bands like the Flaming Lips, but even Dark Punk and even Stephen Winwood have claimed this album had a big influence on them at the time. As you'd expect from the concept, you know, this is all synths and not the strings and everything, but the synths are used there for a reason, you know, for the concept and the cold, unfeeling technology and everything, and it really works great. As a concept, it has a really lovely arc, you know, musically and narratively, and 21st Century Man is the absolute perfect closer for what is a very, very enjoyable listen. At number 3, their 5th album from 1975, Face the Music. So this is a short album. There's only 8 songs on here, but it's very potent, and that's a good example of how Jeff Lynne was really beginning to sort of find his feet with the balance between the pop songs and the orchestration. You know, all the ELO elements are here on this album, and in great form. The singles are fantastic. Strange Magic, Sweet Talking Woman, Epic, Higher on Fire is a great song. But you've got really, really good album tracks on here like Night Rider and Poker and the playful sort of down Hometown, and the lovely closer, One Summer Dream. You can hear more concision and focus in Lynne's writing, and you know it was all about to pay off massively with their next couple of albums. So in a way, this is kind of like ELO's Rubber Soul. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. By now every song has absolute maximum sing-along ability. And also I think it's important because this is the start of their classic lineup with Jeff Lynne, Bev Bevan, Richard Tandy, Kelly Grouchett, Mick Kaminsky, Hugh McDowell and Melvin Gale. Criminally, the album didn't chart in the UK, but it got to number 8 in the States and went gold. So number 2 on my list is from 1976, their 6th album, New World Record. So Lynn by now had absolutely perfected the 3-minute pop song, and it was paying off massively, particularly with this album, because this is really their big breakthrough album. Sold 5 million copies in the first year alone, multi-platinum on both sides of the Atlantic. Top 10 in the UK, number 5 in the USA. And again, you just reel off the singles and you can see why. Living Thing, Rockariah, Telephone Line, which was their first gold single, Do Ya, which was a revamp of an old Move song. It was recorded in Musicland Studios in Germany, where many, many other great 70s bands like Queen had recorded. And I think, unlike some of the previous ELO albums, the strings don't dominate on this record. They accompany and they embellish beautifully, and none of it's overblown. Robert Christgau, writer I really like, he called them moody blues with brains, hooks and laughs, which made me smile. And there really isn't a duff track on here. And many people prefer this to Out of the Blue, their big, massive double album, because it's shorter and pithier. But that does bring me to my number 1 ELO album, and it is their 7th album from 1977, Out of the Blue. This is a classic double album, and I have talked about this in the Double Albums show. Over 10 million copies sold, and I referred to it as like a tasty box of chocolate assortments. There's so much to enjoy in here. Jeff Lynne wrote the album in 4 weeks in a sort of crazy writing fit of inspiration. It was their first album on Jet after all the legal issues with UA. There are people who deride this album and ELO generally. They claim everything's too sterile and perfect, and there's a lack of madness and insanity in their music. I disagree with that. If you want madness and insanity in your music, you can find it, elsewhere. But, if you want to hear beautiful pop songs, stunningly crafted, you can hear real joy and a love of music in Jeff Lynne's writing and the way he approaches his craft. Even if some of it is very derivative, I like to accept ELO, on their own merits, and you don't need to overanalyze it, and you just sit back there and revel in the great tunes. The third side of this album is the conceptual side, Concerto for a Rainy Day. And so there is, as always, crazy ambition there with Jeff Lynne as well. And it's like ELO is his great big toy, and he's just going to play with it any way he wants to. Turn to Stone, Sweet Talking Woman, a Wild West Hero, It's Over, of course, Mr. Blue Sky. This was the first double album to garner 4 top 20 US singles. And in 2000, Colin Larkin named it the 346th best album of all time. 346th! It was 23rd on VH1's 35 best-selling double albums of all time. So, wow, what more recommendation do you need? So that's my ELO top 10. What else is there outside the top 10? Well, as I've said, the Xanadu soundtrack, terrible film, but the soundtrack's kind of okay. It's got a couple of songs I really, really like on it, particularly All Over the World. Lynne went on in 1987 to join the Travelling Wilburys with George Harrison, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison and Bob Dylan, and they made 2 records. The first one I think is particularly good. Eventually ELO became Jeff Lynne's ELO, and he made some records like Zoom and Alone in the Universe, which are very, very listenable, but I don't really regard them as ELO albums. So it was kind of whether I consider them in this list or not, I don't know. Tell me if I'm wrong. Tell me. And eventually there was that reappraisal of ELO's music, and he ended up becoming the darling of the Radio 2 market and playing Hyde Park and Wembley Stadium. Funny enough, with some members of Take That's band, and he did some production for Take That as well. And funny enough, I did a show with Mark Owen a few years ago and talked to him about Jeff Lynne and his time in Malibu at Jeff Lynne's studio. And he said all they did was sit around all day and listen to Jeff Lynne telling Beatles stories, which sounds exactly like my kind of recording session. So the ELO now, I think, have a sort of multi-generational army of fans, brought up on the, not only the stuff from the 70s, but Mr. Blue Sky and songs like that in particular. ELO Part 2, they made some albums and toured, but in the face of a lot of legal action from Jeff Lynne, who I think there was a little bit of animosity there, and to the point where Jeff Lynne actually re-recorded the best of ELO with him playing all the instruments. He claims, he didn't like the original recordings and they needed to be, more perfect. So, thereby denying his old bandmates their session royalties on those records. But, he is a perfectionist and he just wants it the way he wants it. So, who am I to judge or argue? But look, that's my ELO top 10. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm sure you don't agree as ever. So tell me where I've gone wrong, and we'll discuss it in the comments below. I'm sorry I was away for a little bit, but I've been working on my own music. But I will be back again very soon with another episode of Rock Records Reviewed. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.